Some moments in history don't just happen. They build and they simmer and then they finally explode. And the Russian Revolution? Well, that was one of the biggest explosions of all time, an event that completely redrew the map of the 20th century. But here's the thing, to really get the explosion, you've got to understand the incredible pressure that was building up for decades. So in this explainer, we're going to look at the anatomy of that pressure cooker and set the stage for one of history's most earth-shattering events.
All right, so here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll look at the fuel, these radical new ideas that were basically setting Europe on fire. Then, we'll get into the container itself, the very unique, very strange society of the Russian Empire. We'll see the first cracks start to show in a kind of trial-run revolution. And then we'll see how World War I turned up the heat to a level nobody could stand, pushing the whole system right to the edge of total collapse.
So, first things first, the fuel. Before we even step foot in Russia, we have to get a feel for the climate in 19th century Europe. The French Revolution had totally uncorked the bottle, right? It proved that the old ways, kings, aristocrats, all that, it wasn't set in stone. Suddenly, everything was up for grabs, and these powerful new ideas about how a society should actually work were just spreading like wildfire. And this slide really shows you the main battle lines in that war of ideas. You basically had three competing visions. You had the liberals, who wanted to put a check on kings with parliaments and protect individual rights. But they were a little hesitant about full-on democracy. They kind of thought only men with property should get to vote. Then you had the radicals, who went way further. They wanted a government run by the majority, they supported votes for women, and they wanted to get rid of the privileges of the super rich. And then, of course, you had the conservatives, who saw this and wanted to pump the brakes, arguing, hey, let's slow down and respect tradition. But there was this other idea floating around, one that was way more explosive than all the rest: socialism. And this wasn't just about who gets to vote. No, this was a challenge to the entire economic system that was taking over the world. Socialists looked at the factories, the terrible wages, the huge gap between the owners and the workers, and they pointed to one single culprit: private property. Their solution? Simple. Take property away from private hands and give it to society to control. And this is what really lit the fuse. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels took that socialist theory and turned it into an electrifying call to arms. They argued that all of history was just one big story of class conflict, and that a final, epic showdown between the capitalist owners and the working class was not just coming, it was necessary. This wasn't just some vague idea, it was a prophecy of revolution. The message was powerful, it was clear, and it was ready. All that potent fuel just needed the right place to ignite.
Okay, so we've got the fuel. Now let's talk about the pressure cooker itself, the Russian Empire. Because while the rest of Europe was industrializing and debating all these new political ideas, Russia was a world apart. Its unique mix of absolute monarchy, staggering inequality, and just its sheer size made it incredibly vulnerable to the exact ideas we've been talking about.
And this chart just lays it all out, doesn't it? Look at these numbers. At the start of the 20th century, a staggering 85% of people in Russia were farmers. 85%. Now, compare that to France or Germany, where it was, less than half. This wasn't a modern industrial country. It was a massive, sprawling empire of peasants, ruled by a tiny little elite in a system that honestly felt more medieval than modern. And this society was just rigidly divided. At the very top, you had Tsar Nicholas II, an autocrat. He answered to nobody and truly believed he ruled by the will of God. Below him, the nobility, the crown, and the church owned pretty much everything. Then you had the factory workers who, even though they were a small group, were packed into cities like St. Petersburg and Moscow, living in just horrific conditions. We're talking 15-hour workdays. And then there was the vast ocean of peasants who worked the land but didn't own it and were just simmering with resentment for the nobles they felt had stolen it from them. Now, even the workers weren't all one big happy family. A skilled metalworker, for instance, might look down on other laborers. But you know what? What united them was so much stronger than what divided them. When they were faced with getting fired or just unbearable conditions, they got organized. They went on strike. Their shared misery was turning them into a really powerful, unified force. And out in the countryside, whoa, the peasants were anything but passive. See, unlike in a place like France, where peasants might respect the local nobles, Russian peasants absolutely hated them. They wanted the nobles' land and they were not afraid to try and take it. They'd refused to pay rent, and violent uprisings, including killing landlords, became more and more common, especially around 1902 and 1905.
You can just feel the pressure inside this container building and building. And in 1905, boom, the pressure cooker cracks for the first time. Russia was losing a war with Japan, the economy was a mess, and the people had just had enough. What happened next was the 1905 revolution, the first major crack in the whole Tsarist system. It was a massive warning shot, a giant flashing sign that the system was incredibly weak. A warning the Tsar completely ignored.
Just look at how fast this all happened. It starts with an economic crisis. People's actual wages dropped by 20%. Then comes Bloody Sunday, when the Tsar's troops fired on peaceful protesters, killing over 100 people. That just lit a match. Nationwide strikes paralyzed the country. Even professionals, lawyers, doctors, joined in demanding a constitution. The Tsar, under all this pressure, finally gave in and created the Duma, an elected parliament. But it was a trick. As soon as things calmed down, he dismissed the first two Dumas and just changed the voting laws so it had no real power.
So the big question is, was it a failed revolution? Well, in the short term, yeah, the Tsar was still in charge. But in the long run, oh, it was an absolutely priceless lesson. Think of it like a dress rehearsal for the main event. The revolutionaries learned how to organize, the workers saw that they had the power to shut the whole country down, and everybody learned that the Tsar would only give reforms when his back was against the wall, and would take them away the first chance he got. The big problems weren't solved, they were just swept under the rug.
So if 1905 was a crack in the pressure cooker, then World War I, well, that was like someone taking a blowtorch to it. This was the event that turned the heat up to the absolute maximum, straining every single resource, every institution, and every last ounce of loyalty in the Russian Empire until it just started to buckle and break.
Let's just start with the raw human cost. By 1917, Russia had suffered over 7 million casualties. 7 million. Just let that number sink in for a second. That's killed, wounded, or captured. The Russian steamroller, as their army was called, was just getting crushed. For millions of families back home, the war meant nothing but heartbreak and a growing sense of despair.
And it gets worse. The horror wasn't just on the battlefield. As the Russian army retreated, they had this policy of destroying everything, crops, buildings, so the enemy couldn't use them. This created over 3 million refugees inside their own country. I mean, think about that. A government causing a massive crisis of displaced, homeless, starving people among its own population. It was an absolute catastrophe that destroyed any faith people had left in the Tsar.
And meanwhile, back home, the whole system was just collapsing. Russia's industry started to disintegrate, the railways broke down so you couldn't get supplies where they needed to go, all the able-bodied men were being sent to fight, causing massive labor shortages, food production just plummeted because all the grain was being sent to the army. By the miserable winter of 1916, people in the cities were starving. Riots at bread shops weren't just happening, they were common. The system was broken.
Which brings us to our final scene, for this part of the story anyway. We're in the capital city, Petrograd. They'd changed the name from the German-sounding St. Petersburg, and it's the brutal, unforgiving winter of 1917. This is the spot. This is where all those pressures we've talked about, the radical ideas, the deep inequality, the memory of 1905, and the disaster of the war are all about to collide. The city itself was a perfect symbol for the whole country. On one side of the river, you had the fancy neighborhoods, the government buildings, the Tsar's winter palace, and on the other side, the sprawling, overcrowded workers' quarters and all the factories. And that winter was just unbelievably cold. Heavy snow, deep frost. And over in those workers' quarters, where the food shortages were hitting the hardest, things were getting truly, truly desperate. The stage was set, the fuse was lit, and it was getting very, very short. So that's where we're going to leave it. You've got an army that's about to mutiny, a people who are literally starving, and a leader who has lost all credibility and respect. Every single condition for an explosion is in place. So the question is, what happens next? What's the spark that finally causes this whole thing to blow? We'll find out in part 2.